Today we're going to be speaking about a difficult subject of domestic abuse. We therefore ask you to take care of yourselves. If you ever feel that you're in danger, please ring 999. If you feel you need someone to talk to, please contact Refuge on their 24-hour helpline. Their number is 0808 2000 247. Or specifically for men, there is the Men's Advice Line on 0808 8010 327, or Mankind on 0182 333 4244. There's also a helpline for people who may be facing forced marriages or honor crime. That is the Kana Nirvana, and they're on 0800 599 247. So today we're going to talk a bit about how domestic abuse law has changed over the past year or two. And I'm going to be asking Musa a few questions around that. So, Musa, can you tell me a bit about the Domestic Abuse Act that was introduced last year?
Sure. So, the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 is an act that was passed to essentially give victims of domestic abuse a lot more protection and a lot more security. So the Act came into force following the Domestic Abuse Bill being agreed by the House of Commons and the House of Lords in January 2022, and it received royal assent. The main part of the Act is to provide a legal definition of domestic abuse. So the Act allows for a wider recognition of, or in relation to domestic abuse related crimes, as well as recognition to victims, survivors and perpetrators. It emphasizes that domestic abuse is not just physical violence, but it can also be emotional, controlling, coercive, and financial abuse as well, which is something that is not too recognized today. We work with a lot of clients who are still in the old mentality that domestic abuse is only physical abuse, but domestic abuse can be covered by a lot of things. So essentially, there are quite a lot of parts of the Act, but I won't go into too much detail. I'll just mention a couple of points about the Act that would kind of give people a better understanding of what was passed. So
you're going to sort of give a bit more of a description of what domestic abuse actually is.
Okay, yeah, I can do that. That's completely fine. So domestic abuse, like I said, it doesn't just include physical abuse, which is what is kind of an old mentality that people have. It does include emotional, financial, verbal abuse. There are some cases that there was no physical abuse at all, but the emotional abuse and manipulation was done to an extent that forces the other person to actually commit suicide. So, and that's a case where there's no physical abuse at all. So that's why the Act was passed, to define domestic abuse doesn't have to just be physical. It does include a lot of other things as well.
That's quite interesting, because there was a criminal law case where a lady was convicted for killing her husband, but that was because of years of domestic abuse, but it wasn't actually physical violence. It was the other side of things, like the coercive control and the emotional issues. But on appeal, and it was a very lengthy appeal, her conviction was actually overturned. I think she ended up with manslaughter as opposed to a murder conviction. But she was released from prison because along the lines of what you're saying, the law is starting to recognise that domestic abuse doesn't just have to be violent, and these sort of coercive controls and emotional sort of control and mental abuse does lead people to doing quite, extreme things.
Yeah, definitely. Sure. So I'll quickly state a couple of things that would be useful for the listeners to know. So the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, it actually places a duty on local authorities in England to provide accommodation-based support to victims of domestic abuse and their children in refuges and other types of safe accommodation. So what that means is the local authorities are under a duty to actually help you. So it's not the case that if you're a victim of domestic abuse, you need to be scared of, I have nowhere to go. How can I flee domestic abuse when nobody can help me? Now there is a duty on the local authorities that they will have to help you and your children.
So are we talking about first instance of refuge and then maybe long-term housing?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And as well, we deal with quite a lot of these types of cases as well, where tenancies from local authorities can actually be transferred into the sole name of a victim of domestic abuse, allowing them home rights to stay in the home, giving them the protection as well. That will essentially put their mind at ease and keep them protected. Furthermore, the Act actually prohibits perpetrators of abuse from cross-examining their victims in court. So a lot of cases that we deal with, the clients are always quite scared, and they're quite fearful of taking the other person to court for a number of reasons. But the Act actually provides them with a lot of security. So it means when going to court, the Act actually provides victims of domestic abuse the ability to have special measures in court. That's something that will give victims a lot of stability. It will give them a lot of peace of mind. So what that means is when they're in court, they don't have to see the perpetrator. So in court, you can arrange for separate entrances, you can arrange for separate waiting rooms, and if actually physically in the court hearing, you can actually arrange for screens. So the victim will actually not see the perpetrator at all, and that can kind of put them at ease as well. Going on.
But what happens, for example, so, these days access to justice is quite difficult because a lot of people can't afford solicitors. So what happens if a perpetrator actually goes to court and he hasn't got a solicitor, or she hasn't got a solicitor? How does he get his questions over to the victim?
Okay, so that's something the Act actually covers as well. So the Act actually prevents perpetrators from cross-examining victims of domestic abuse. So if they were, usually how it would work in the past is there was nothing stopping perpetrators from cross-examining in court. So it can put, victims in quite a lot of pressure. They would, it's quite fearful for someone to be a victim of domestic abuse and the other person, the perpetrator, is asking you questions and putting you on the spot. In court, it's quite scary, it's quite a daunting thing. The Act actually prohibits them from doing it now. So the questions, the cross-examining questions actually have to come through solicitors now. So it gives security to the victim of domestic abuse.
Okay, so I assume if the perpetrator is not a solicitor, then the judges will do the questioning on their behalf.
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
Right.
So carrying on, another useful part of the Act, it actually means you mentioned about legal aid. So part of the Act actually prohibits GPs and other health professionals from charging a victim of domestic abuse for a letter to support them.
That's
so
good.
Essentially, the way legal aid works, you would need a supporting letter or evidence of domestic abuse to basically support your legal aid application. That's something that victims of domestic abuse might have been fearful in the past because GPs would charge for the letter. And if you're already in a financial situation where your finances are quite tight, you can't afford to be paying your GP for a letter that would, assist you in your legal aid application. So now the healthcare professionals and GPs, they're actually prohibited from charging for it. So that opens a lot of doors for a lot of victims of domestic abuse who might not be in the best financial situation to not be fearful and, take that step in seeking legal advice and seeking the help that they need.
Okay. Is there anything else you might want to update people on the change in the law?
Yeah, bear with me one moment.
So I know that previously there was a thing called domestic violence protection order that the police could use if they went to a property and they felt there had been domestic abuse. An individual could be removed from the property and be subject to what's called a DVPO.
Yeah.
So how's any changes happened there? Because I know DVPOs were quite limited in scope.
So the Act introduces 2 new civil protection injunctions. So you touched on one of them. The new one is the domestic abuse protection notice. So that's for immediate protection following an incident. A domestic abuse protection order, that's actually flexible and more long-term protection for victims. So they're covered in both ways. They're covered for immediate protection and they're also covered for long-term
Long-term.
protection as well.
So in reality, there may be individuals who won't need to keep seeking non-molestation orders, which can be challenged in court.
That's correct, yeah. And as you know as well, with non-molestation orders, the maximum amount that they can be granted by the court is only 12 months. And that is down to the discretion of the judge as well. So it's a really good thing that's been passed by the Domestic Abuse Act.
Okay. So in practice, do you think the new law provides better protection?
Yeah, definitely. I think further to the protection, it adds security for victims of domestic abuse. There's a lot of things that puts victims of domestic abuse minds at ease. For example, we touched on the domestic abuse not being limited to physical abuse, because a lot of people might feel stuck that they're going through an abusive relationship, but they might feel that they're not victims of physical abuse, so how can they seek out help? How can they speak to someone? But the Act now actually allows them to, the Act actually specifies that domestic abuse doesn't have to be physical. It is actually emotional, verbal, financial, psychological as well. So I think it's, as well as better protection, it provides that added security for victims of domestic abuse.
That's great. And so, in a nutshell, the Act is providing better access to justice then?
Definitely, yeah, definitely.
Okay. And can you tell us about any other protections that there might be? So I know previous to the Act being passed, there was something called Clare's Law.
Yep.
Is there anything around that you can actually share with listeners?
Yeah, definitely. So Clare's Law is actually a scheme that was named after Claire Wood, who was actually murdered by her abusive ex-boyfriend in 2009. So it was formally passed in England and Wales in 2014. So essentially, oh, sorry, bear with me one moment. Sorry, Clare's Law means that you have the right to apply to the police to find out if your ex-partner has an abusive background. So if your ex-partner's ever been kind of convicted for domestic abuse, you actually have the right to find that out now. So the way that it works is you can actually go onto your local police's website, you can actually fill in an online application form, and then that information will be released to you. The other thing, if you don't feel comfortable with using, a website or completing an application form, you can actually attend your local police station. You can actually speak to an officer, and then they will assist you with, making that application.
Okay, and is it only the person who's in the relationship that can do that, or could it be a family member who's quite concerned? Could they make that sort of application?
Do you know what? 1 second. Let me have a look. I think it can be anybody who's got that concern of domestic abuse.
So a legitimate concern.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah, because I suppose sometimes people in the situation don't realise
That's right.
that they're actually in an abusive situation at the time.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And is there any other useful information for victims of DV?
One thing I wanted to kind of bring to the listeners' attention is an actual scheme called Annie. So what that is it's actually, Annie is actually a code word. It's ANI. It stands for Action Needed Immediately. So it's a scheme that's been developed by the Home Office to allow domestic abuse sufferers to signal that they need emergency help. The way it works is they would signal to a chemist or a pharmacist. So you would essentially walk into the pharmacy and you would ask for Annie. You would know if the pharmacy is kind of participating in that scheme because they will have posters outside. So what happens is you will speak to a staff member or a pharmacist and you'll ask for Annie. They will then take you into a private consultation room. So for example, even if you were with the perpetrator of domestic abuse, they would remove you from that situation. They will find out if your situation is it urgent? Are you in immediate danger? And they will then either call the police or they will refer you to the correct kind of support organizations. So they might advise you, if it's not urgent, they might advise you to call 101, or they might call, the police right there and then on your behalf. So yeah, it's really good. It's a really good scheme that would help victims seek that help, even if they're in a situation where they're at home and they can't call the police, because a lot of times you are stuck in the same property as the perpetrator of abuse. Sometimes the abusers are really controlling, so they won't let you out of their sight. If you go to a pharmacy, speak to the chemist or the pharmacist, they can take you away from the abuser and then, contact the police on your behalf.
Okay, that's great. Sounds like a really helpful scheme.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you said, sometimes people are quite trapped, or they don't really build up the courage to ask for assistance as well. Yep. So can you tell me a bit about what Islam says about domestic abuse?
Definitely. So the Quran, to be honest, it contains many verses expressing good treatment and kindness to women. There are other verses that show disapproval of oppression or ill treatment of women. And in general, there is actually a surah named after women, just showing the status that women have in Islam and the kind of rights they're given. There's also a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, the best amongst you is the one who is best to his wife. So just from these things, we kind of notice how you should be treating, your wife in Islam, and just in the way that abuse is not something that's supported in Islam. Is something that's actually really strongly prohibited, and the complete opposite. Good treatment and kindness is, encouraged in Islam.
That's good to hear. I know within English law, they're now saying that if a child witnesses domestic abuse, then they're deemed to be victims of domestic abuse. And I know, obviously, in the work that you do, you must see male men who are also victims of domestic abuse. Definitely. As well. So the hadith and the Quran that you've mentioned, the verse of the Quran you've mentioned, talk about women. Mm-hmm. So what does it say about the protection of men and children?
So I don't think there's specifically, Quranic verses about men and children specifically, but there is an ayah about how they are clothing for you and you are clothing for them. So I think it's hunna libasul lakum wa antum libasul lahun. So from clothing, what does clothing do? We can kind of understand that clothing protects you. It covers your flaws, it beautifies you, it adorns you. So just judging from this, if you are to be clothing for a person and that person are to be clothing for you, so it's mutual. The good treatment is mutual to both of you, and like I said, good treatment and kindness is encouraged in Islam for the both of you.
So we would expect that to extend to children as well then. Yes, so everybody definitely gets treated with mercy, empathy, and compassion.
You're right, exactly, yeah.
Indeed. In your life... Oh. No, not that question.
That one's fine.
8? Yeah. Okay. So in your line of work, have you ever seen... do you ever see one culture being more prevalent to abuse than any other? So did it happen more in one type of family than any other, or traditional, so forth?
So in our line of work, to be honest, there is no specific culture that stands out. I wanted to kind of touch on this as well, because it's not specifically a set culture that we notice there are a lot of victims of domestic abuse. There are a lot of abusive relationships. We work with a wide range of types of cases, even extending to not just females that are victims of domestic abuse, but also males. It's not limited to gender. It's not limited to age. There are cases where a person can be in their 70s and 80s that we've been dealing with recently, that they are victims of domestic abuse, and sometimes it takes them a long time to realize that they're victims of domestic abuse. So to answer your questions, I wouldn't say that there's a specific culture that stands out, rather that domestic abuse is so widespread that we deal with many types of clients, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of culture, religious beliefs. So it's just something that needs awareness, basically.
You said that sometimes people don't realize they're in an abusive relationship. Have you ever been in a position where a client's speaking to you and you're actually having to point out to them that actually their relationship is abusive?
So yes, I actually have. Going back to what I was speaking about earlier is with legal aid and accessing public funding for your legal costs. one of the things is that you need to be a victim of domestic abuse. So I will ask the client, are you a victim of domestic abuse? And they will say to me, no, to be honest, I don't think I'm a victim of domestic abuse because he hasn't ever physically hit me. And then I will stop them there and then and say, it doesn't have to specifically be physical abuse. I'll then say, how were you treated in your relationship? What types of things would happen? How would they make you feel? If they would then tell me, I would always be sworn at, I would always be kind of addressed with derogatory terms, the other person would always put me down, I will then think, that straight away, that's verbal abuse. If you're always putting someone down, that's also emotional abuse, which is something that the Domestic Abuse Act that we were speaking about earlier, it touches on, and it kind of gives that clarity that physical abuse isn't just domestic abuse. Domestic abuse covers a lot more now.
So it sounds like there's an education issue that people don't actually recognise what domestic abuse is.
Definitely, yeah.
Just wondering how we would get that sort of education out there.
I think it's, to be honest, raising awareness, because us being in our line of work, of course we know about the Domestic Abuse Act, but a lot of people that they're not in the legal field, they wouldn't know about the Domestic Abuse Act. So I think it's about speaking about it, not being shy to speak about it, because in our culture it might be a little bit of a taboo subject. It might be something that you kind of don't want to speak about, you don't want other people to know, but I think it's important to reach out because it's not nice for anybody to be in an abusive relationship. So raising awareness, speaking out, seeking help, I think that's what we need to do going forward.
And I suppose the way domestic abuse happens is when you're a child and you recognize and you see certain things happening in your own family, you sort of grow up and you think it's okay.
Definitely,
and you might replicate that same sort of behavior as well.
Exactly.
So, archetypal, if you see dad sort of shouting and swearing at mum, you may be, and you're a male child, you may grow up to be a man that does that to his own wife.
And yeah, that's exactly something that we want to avoid. It's not right. And I think it's raising awareness about it will hopefully prevent these types of things happening in the future.
Yeah. Okay. And I suppose that's also why they say children witnessing domestic abuse are actually victims of it themselves.
Domestic abuse themselves, yeah.
Because
definitely.
they learn that sort of behaviour and it becomes an ongoing cyclical sort of problem.
You're right, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I know, it's quite a weighty subject, but are there any statistics that you can share with people for people to understand how prevalent domestic abuse actually is within, their communities?
I think going back to raising awareness, I think if sharing these statistics will actually, allow the viewers to understand how common domestic abuse is. So I'll share a couple statistics with you. So in the year ending March 2020, this isn't even current. In 2020, an estimated 2.3 million adults aged 16 to 74 years old experienced domestic abuse in the last year. So if you think about it, 2.3 million, it's a massive number, and it's not something nice to hear. But just to give the listeners a kind of understanding, that's how many people are or have said that they've experienced domestic abuse in the last year. And that's not even taken into consideration the people that haven't spoken out about the domestic abuse that they were suffering from.
And within that statistic, is it broken down between men and women?
Yeah, so 1.6 million were women and 750,000 were actually men. So it's a lot more. People would, kind of think in general that it's always women that are victims of domestic abuse. But if you look at it, there are, within that statistic itself, 757,000 of the victims were actually men.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And then when you look back and you think, well, those men probably recognise it because it might have been a violent relationship. But then you start thinking about the other parts of domestic abuse. And
definitely.
So there might be more men out there in abusive relationships and they don't recognise it for what it is.
Definitely. And I think men in general kind of find it a little bit more difficult to speak out about because, like I said, it's generalised that women are always victims of domestic abuse. So men can find it difficult to speak about. But hopefully with this act coming into place, it can give a lot more people, not just men, but women and men, better access to justice, more security in seeking legal help and, speaking out for assistance.
So are there any further stats you could share with us?
Yeah, perfect. I'll carry on. So 1 in 4 women in England and Wales actually experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. I feel this one's quite a scary fact as well. To kind of imagine that 1 in 4 women are experiencing domestic abuse in their lifetime. Domestic abuse actually feels incredibly isolating, but the numbers actually tell a different story, that, you are not alone. So I would just urge everyone to just seek out help, speak to somebody about it, and then remove yourself from that situation. Do everything that you can to help yourself.
So that's actually a feature of domestic abuse as well, isn't it? The perpetrator will try to isolate the victim. Mm-hmm. So, they will remove them from their friends, their family, or their support network, the community network, and things like that.
Definitely.
And then make them think that the abuse happening to them is actually their fault. Yeah. And because our communities don't talk about these things very much, victims often feel quite ashamed that they are victims, and so they withdraw into themselves as well. Definitely. So it's quite important that we have some form of network to allow victims to sort of talk up about this.
That brings us on quite nicely to the next statistic. It's actually a fact that domestic abuse is actually linked to depression and homelessness. So the fact of isolating can obviously lead to depression. Women who experience domestic abuse are twice as likely to experience depression, and 40% of homeless women actually state domestic abuse as a contributing factor to their homelessness. So that's quite concerning as well. But like you said, it's directly linked to the domestic abuse, being isolated from your family members and feeling like you have nowhere to turn and nowhere to go.
And then I suppose if it's leading to homelessness, it's either that they're running away or because the perpetrators always sort of control the finances.
Yes.
So they are left financially illiterate and probably without a fund to support themselves.
Yeah.
Or even probably haven't even worked.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, going back to the Domestic Abuse Act, it's so beneficial that local authorities are now under duty to assist, victims of domestic abuse and their children. So even if you are pushed to homelessness, you can, kind of have that little bit of reassurance that the local authorities now have a duty to help you and protect you. Touching on children as well, 20% of children in the UK have actually lived with an adult perpetrating domestic abuse. 20% might not sound like a lot, but that's actually 1 in 5 children. So that just shows how much of an issue domestic abuse is and how much of an issue that it is, that it needs to be spoken about.
That's quite a scary statistic, because if you look at an average class size of 30 children, you're talking about 6 children from a class maybe experiencing domestic abuse at home.
Definitely, yeah. I'll just carry on. So, domestic abuse, another fact is domestic abuse actually gets worse during pregnancy. So about 20% of women in refuges, they're actually pregnant or have recently given birth. Young girls in the UK also report high incidence of sexual violence, which is something that we need to be aware of. 41% of UK girls aged 14 to 17 in an intimate relationship experience some form of sexual violence from their partner. So I think that's another thing that it's difficult for people to talk about. If you are a victim of sexual abuse, it's something that you don't want anybody to know. You feel like you might not be able to speak to your family about it. Even reporting it to the police, we deal with so many cases that the abuse isn't reported initially. It's actually reported so much later on, once they've kind of finally taken that step to remove themselves from that situation and they feel safe enough to report the abuse. But I think the purpose of sharing these statistics is just to kind of give the listeners an insight into how common domestic abuse is. And I think it's sharing these types of things. It actually proves how scary it is, and how much anybody we know can be a victim of domestic abuse. It's just a point of raising awareness about it, speaking about it, and assisting or asking for help. Sorry.
Indeed. Well, those are very scary facts, but I'm glad you shared them with us, and hopefully it will sort of motivate people who may be victims to make some changes in their lives as well, because they can realise that it's such a massive problem. They're not alone, and there are people out there that are available to assist them.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose the other side of it that we haven't really spoke about are the perpetrators.
Mm-hmm.
So do you know of any sort of assistance to perpetrators who maybe recognise that they have a problem and, you know, might want to do something about it?
So with perpetrators, there are actually programs. So for example, if you're going through court proceedings, domestic abuse proceedings, the court can actually order perpetrators to attend these programs. So these programs are usually, you can actually self-refer yourself. So they will kind of give you an understanding as a perpetrator what's classed as abuse, because some people might be abusing and they don't even realize it. So there are programs out there that would help perpetrators.
I suppose that's, again, going back to learned behaviour.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You're right, yeah.
Okay. And I suppose there's agencies that relate, that will do sort of perpetrator type related programs.
That's correct, that's
and there's also anger management programs as well. I mean, if you go to your GP can refer you as well to certain programs that might be of assistance. Because as you said, sometimes people just need to relearn the behaviours that they learnt in their youth. And, you know, it might go to sort of saving that relationship as well.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. That information was very helpful. I would just like to repeat the helpline numbers as well for anybody that's a victim of domestic abuse. So as I said before, if you feel like you're in danger, please do ring 999 straight away. But if you're not in immediate danger, then there is the Refuge helpline on 0808 200 247. And then specifically for men victims of domestic abuse, there's a men's advice line on 0808 8010 327, or Mankind on 0182 333 4244. And if you're a victim of forced marriage and honour crime, there's Karma Nirvana on 0800 599 247. So you've been listening to Gina Samuel Richards of AGR Law and Musa Ali, apprentice solicitor, on the Legal Hour on Radio Ramadan. Ramadan FM is supporting Leicester Hospital's charity this year to create a spiritual care centre at the Leicester Royal Infirmary. This space will be used by hospital staff, patients and the community as a place to reflect and pray, forming part of the healing process for our communities. So to support this year's 10,000 fundraising appeal with donation, please go to the Ramadan Radio's 2023 Just Giving page. So that's www.justgiving.com/page/Ramadan Radio 2023. Thank you.